Hey folks, tonight we're diving into something a little stranger than usual. Forget haunted castles or cursed swords. This time, we're talking about a king, not just any king. A king who stripped naked on his throne just to understand his people better. Yeah, you heard that right. So, before we peel back the velvet curtains of royal weirdness, hit that like button and subscribe. Only if you're really enjoying these twisted tales of history, though. Also, let me know where you're tuning in from. It's always wild to see if you're listening from a cozy spot in Chicago or stuck in traffic somewhere in New York. I'm over here in a dimly lit room with a cup of lukewarm tea, trying to wrap my head around what on earth this man was thinking. Anyway, lights down, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's step into the royal chambers of absurdity. You're not going to believe this one. Imagine a time when being a king didn't necessarily mean glittering crowns and polished speeches. Instead, picture a ruler so eccentric, so bizarre, that he became infamous not for his battles, but for walking around the palace like he'd just escaped a Roman bathhouse. This was King Charles VI of France, or as his people eventually called him, Charles the Mad. Now, Charles didn't start off that way. When he took the throne at the ripe age of 11 in 1380, France was still licking its wounds from the 100 Years' War. He was the classic royal package: charming, athletic, fluent in courtly graces. People had high hopes. You know the type: elegant jawline, slightly tragic backstory, and a whole army ready to follow him into glory. But what they didn't expect was that he would slowly unravel like a sock in a washing machine. The first real signs of trouble showed up in his early 20s. One day, in the middle of a forest ride with his guards, Charles suddenly froze. Without warning, he drew his sword and began wildly swinging at his own knights, screaming that they were traitors sent to kill him. By the time his companions subdued him, one knight lay dead, and Charles had collapsed, trembling and speechless. Just boom, snap, like a mental switch had been flipped. Doctors at the time didn't know what to do. Medieval medicine, as you can probably guess, was about as effective as throwing a wet sponge at a house fire. They tried bleeding him, chanting prayers, even using herbal soothing infusions. Nothing worked. And so began a reign that would go down in history for its strange, tragic brilliance. But the real kicker, he didn't just lash out occasionally. He believed he was made of glass. Yep, glass. Like your grandma's flower vase. He was terrified of breaking, so he wore reinforced clothes and forbade people from touching him too suddenly. He even had iron rods sewn into his robes for structural integrity. Imagine attending a royal ball and seeing your monarch glide past you with the stiffness of a coat rack. Try not to laugh. And then there were the naked episodes. Charles would sometimes strip off all his clothes, wander the palace, and insist he was a commoner. "I must live as they live," he'd say. This wasn't some political stunt. He truly believed it. Servants found him crouching behind doors, murmuring about taxes and bread prices, acting as if he were a baker from the slums. The royal advisors, they were horrified, but they couldn't exactly fire the king. So they did what any medieval court would do. They covered for him. He once sat on the throne butt naked, delivering a rambling speech about fishmongers and how smelly boots were a sign of dignity. The court scribes, bless their hearts, dutifully took notes while trying not to burst out laughing. Can you imagine the minutes from that meeting? His Majesty has declared a new tax on perfume, cites the overwhelming scent of treason. But here's where it gets strangely touching. Underneath the madness was a man who, in some bizarre, broken way, wanted to connect with his people. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't greedy. He wasn't even all that power hungry. He just broke. And through that brokenness, we got one of the strangest, most oddly endearing monarchs history has ever known. It's easy to laugh at a king who thought he was made of glass, or wandered around nude talking about peasant taxes. But if we zoom in a little, Charles VI's story gets darker, and dare I say, a little heartbreaking. The court tried everything to keep things running smoothly. A king losing his grip on reality wasn't exactly great for morale or for war strategy. So, behind the velvet curtains of the palace, a group of power-hungry nobles saw an opportunity. Since Charles wasn't really kinging anymore, his brother Louis of Orleans and his cousin John the Fearless, yeah, that was actually his name, started playing medieval Game of Thrones. And spoiler alert, nobody wins in that game. The two men essentially turned France into their personal chessboard. One ruled while Charles was having one of his many episodes, and the other plotted, whispered, and bribed anyone within earshot. Every time Charles had a moment of clarity, rare but it happened, he would issue a royal decree or try to take control. Then, boom, Glassman mode would return, and the real rulers went back to clawing at each other like alley cats. Meanwhile, the queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, was left to juggle a dozen flaming swords. Some hated her. Some adored her. Some accused her of plotting with enemies. Others of simply trying to protect her children. The truth? She probably did a bit of both. After all, when your husband thinks he's a bottle of Burgundy about to shatter, and the court is a snake pit of lies and daggers, survival becomes your full-time job. Let's pause for a second here. Can you imagine living in a country where every week might bring a new tax because His Majesty decided fish were too loud? Or a new war simply because two cousins got into a slap fight over who got to control the treasury? France was spiraling. The people were confused. The nobles were scheming. And the king, well, he was trying not to crack. Literally. And this wasn't a short phase. Charles VI ruled like this for over 40 years. That's 4 decades of unpredictability, whispered insults behind gloved hands, and palace hallways that probably smelled like stress and overcooked cabbage. His advisors eventually learned to schedule court meetings around his lucid days. They would keep track of what he said, what he did, even how many times he blinked, hoping to detect when another episode might hit. In one particularly bizarre moment, Charles believed he was St. George and began slaying dragons in the garden. Picture this: a middle-aged monarch chasing terrified chickens around with a wooden sword, shouting about fire-breathing monsters while his attendants tried to politely look the other way. The royal scribes eventually stopped writing these things down. It just got too weird. Still, there was one moment that left everyone stunned. During one lucid period, Charles stood before the royal court, wearing the crown, looking sharper than he had in years. He cleared his throat and said something no one expected. "I know what they say, that I'm mad, that I'm no king, but I remember who I am, and I remember my people." You could have heard a pin drop. It didn't last, of course. A few days later, He was back to mumbling about invisible bees in the throne room, but that one sentence haunted the court. It was as if, deep inside all the noise and fear, the real Charles still existed, a trapped man, screaming behind the glass walls of his own mind. It's honestly a little tragic and a little beautiful. He wasn't the king France needed, but he was the king they got. And maybe, just maybe, there's something to admire in a man who lost his mind, but still tried in his own wild way to understand the world outside his castle. Let's rewind a bit. Back to before the glass delusion, before the naked speeches, before the whispers filled the court, because Charles VI didn't just wake up one day and decide, hey, I think I'll lose my grip on reality today. Like most royal disasters, it was a slow burn. Historians have argued for centuries about what exactly went wrong. Some blame genetics. His family tree looked more like a tangled garden hose. The French and Bavarian royal lines had intermarried so often that it was basically a miracle Charles could ride a horse in a straight line. Madness, unfortunately, was something of a family tradition. Others blame stress. I mean, imagine being handed a kingdom still smoldering from war when you're not even old enough to grow a beard. That's got to mess you up. Still, even knowing that, nothing really prepares you for the moment your king forgets who you are mid-sentence and starts accusing your shoes of plotting against him. Let's talk about the day everything started unraveling, the infamous Bal des Ardents, or as I like to call it, the medieval party that went very, very wrong. It was supposed to be a fun evening, a masquerade ball, some light entertainment, maybe a bit of dancing to distract from the collapsing state of the kingdom. Charles, ever the enthusiast, decided to dress up as a wild man, part of a group costume with several of his courtiers. They covered themselves in pitch and feathers, yes, flammable pitch and dry feathers, and danced around with torches. Because nothing says party like becoming a human candle. It was going fine until someone accidentally waved a torch a bit too close. Whoosh! The room lit up like a bonfire. 4 of the dancers died horribly. Charles survived. Barely, thanks to the quick action of a noble woman who threw her skirts over him to smother the flames. But the mental damage was done. After that night, things went from concerning to code red. He stopped recognizing his wife, his children, his servants. One day, he insisted he didn't have a wife at all, and then demanded she be arrested for impersonating the queen. When they brought in the real queen to explain, he screamed and hid behind a tapestry. Another time, he sat in a hallway for hours, whispering to a stone pillar. When asked who he was talking to, he said, "The Duke of Burgundy is hiding in the wall. He knows my secrets." And still, the government carried on, or at least tried to. Think about that for a second. You're trying to run a nation in the middle of economic collapse, war with England, civil unrest, and the bubonic plague, and your boss won't come out of the broom closet because he's afraid the furniture is judging him. That's next-level human resources nightmare. But not all was chaos and despair. Believe it or not, Charles had moments of clarity, brief flickers where he'd speak clearly, ask about taxes, inquire after his advisors' families. During these rare hours, the court would scramble to get real work done. They'd rush in with documents, treaties, reports, anything they'd been waiting weeks to get signed. The irony? Sometimes Charles was surprisingly sharp. He'd edit drafts, strike out entire paragraphs with a flourish, and even lecture his advisors on diplomacy. One scribe described it like watching the sun rise through storm clouds, only to vanish again into darkness. These lucid moments gave people hope that the king could return, that the crown wasn't just a hollow symbol propped up on a broken man's head, but just as quickly, the storm would return. One day, he calmly walked out of the palace and disappeared into the streets of Paris. Guards scrambled to find him. Hours later, they located him in a butcher's shop, arguing with his owner over the price of sausages. He had no crown, no escort, just a stained shirt and a handful of coins he'd stolen from the royal kitchens. He looked at the guards and said, "I am a man like any other. Why should I not bargain for meat?" That was Charles, mad, naked, dangerous, and somehow tragically sincere. So here we are, deep in the madness of a king who wandered the streets looking for sausage deals and held full conversations with stone walls. But let's shift the lens a bit. What was it actually like to live under a ruler like Charles VI? For the people of France, it was like constantly holding your breath. Would tomorrow bring a sensible decree about taxes, or a royal proclamation outlawing the color blue? No one knew. And that uncertainty, it wore everyone down. At the heart of this chaos were the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, two factions who couldn't have been more different if one was made of fire and the other of ice. The Armagnacs supported the king's brother, Louis of Orleans. The Burgundians backed John the Fearless. These two men loathed each other. Think political campaign commercials, but with more assassinations and less smiling. And of course, in the middle of it all was Charles, or rather, the idea of Charles. The Armagnacs claimed they were defending the king's wishes, even when those wishes involved him believing he was a cow and refusing to enter rooms with tile floors. The Burgundians, on the other hand, insisted they were protecting France from a government being run by hallucinations. And when words failed, well, swords worked just fine. The result? France became a battleground, not just against England, but against itself. Picture Paris, once the jewel of Europe, now carved up into neighborhoods ruled by rival gangs of nobles. People were kidnapped in the streets. Shops burned. Nobles rode through the city like warlords, collecting taxes at sword point. And all the while, inside the palace, Charles VI was being fed soup through a silver spoon, completely unaware that his capital was unraveling like an old tapestry. One of the most chilling stories from this time was how letters supposedly written by Charles would arrive in provinces, declaring new laws or summoning nobles to court. But many of these letters were forged, crafted by whichever faction had Charles's seal that week. Imagine receiving a royal command and not knowing if it was from the actual king or just some noble who happened to be in the week's palace power struggle. Obey, and you might be following a lie. Disobey, and you might be accused of treason. It was a mess, a dangerous, deadly mess. And yet life went on. Bakers still baked. Blacksmiths still hammered. Children still played in the alleyways. That's the strange thing about history. We tend to zoom in on the madness at the top, but down below, ordinary people were just trying to survive, avoid getting caught in a crossfire, pay their dues, keep their heads down, and if you were really lucky, maybe you didn't end up on a battlefield in armor 2 sizes too big. let's not forget the church in all this. The clergy tried their best to make sense of the king's condition in spiritual terms. One day, he insisted he didn't have a wife at all, and then demanded she be arrested for impersonating the queen. When they brought in the real queen to explain, he screamed and hid behind a tapestry. Another time, he sat in a hallway for hours, whispering to a stone pillar. When asked who he was talking to, he said, "The Duke of Burgundy is hiding in the wall. He knows my secrets." And still, the government carried on, or at least tried to. Think about that for a second. You're trying to run a nation in the middle of economic collapse, war with England, civil unrest, and the bubonic plague. And your boss won't come out of the broom closet because he's afraid the furniture is judging him. That's next-level human resources nightmare. But not all was chaos and despair. Believe it or not, Charles had moments of clarity, brief flickers where he'd speak clearly, ask about taxes, inquire after his advisors' families. During these rare hours, the court would scramble to get real work done. They'd rush in with documents, treaties, reports, anything they'd been waiting weeks to get signed. The irony? Sometimes Charles was surprisingly sharp. He'd edit drafts, strike out entire paragraphs with a flourish, and even lecture his advisors on diplomacy. One scribe described it like watching the sun rise through storm clouds, only to vanish again into darkness. These lucid moments gave people hope. Hope that the king could return, that the crown wasn't just a hollow symbol propped up on a broken man's head. But just as quickly, the storm would return. One day, he calmly walked out of the palace and disappeared into the streets of Paris. Guards scrambled to find him. Hours later, they located him in a butcher's shop, arguing with his owner over the price of sausages. He had no crown, no escort, just a stained shirt and a handful of coins he'd stolen from the royal kitchens. He looked at the guards and said, "I am a man like any other. Why should I not bargain for meat?" That was Charles, mad, naked, dangerous, and somehow tragically sincere. So here we are, deep in the madness of a king who wandered the streets looking for sausage deals and held full conversations with stone walls. But let's shift the lens a bit. What was it actually like to live under a ruler like Charles VI? For the people of France, it was like constantly holding your breath. Would tomorrow bring a sensible decree about taxes, or a royal proclamation outlawing the color blue? No one knew. And that uncertainty, it wore everyone down. At the heart of this chaos were the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, two factions who couldn't have been more different if one was made of fire and the other of ice. The Armagnacs supported the king's brother, Louis of Orleans. The Burgundians backed John the Fearless. These two men loathed each other. Think political campaign commercials, but with more assassinations and less smiling. And of course, in the middle of it all was Charles, or rather, the idea of Charles. The Armagnacs claimed they were defending the king's wishes, even when those wishes involved him believing he was a cow and refusing to enter rooms with tile floors. The Burgundians, on the other hand, insisted they were protecting France from a government being run by hallucinations. And when words failed, well, swords worked just fine. The result? France became a battleground, not just against England, but against itself. Picture Paris, once the jewel of Europe, now carved up into neighborhoods ruled by rival gangs of nobles. People were kidnapped in the streets, Shops burned. Nobles rode through the city like warlords, collecting taxes at sword point. And all the while, inside the palace, Charles VI was being fed soup through a silver spoon, completely unaware that his capital was unraveling like an old tapestry. One of the most chilling stories from this time was how letters supposedly written by Charles would arrive in provinces, declaring new laws or summoning nobles to court. But many of these letters were forged, crafted by whichever faction had Charles's seal that week. Imagine receiving a royal command and not knowing if it was from the actual king or just some noble who happened to be in the week's palace power struggle. Obey, and you might be following a lie. Disobey, and you might be accused of treason. It was a mess, a dangerous, deadly mess. And yet life went on. Bakers still baked. Blacksmiths still hammered. Children still played in the alleyways. That's the strange thing about history. We tend to zoom in on the madness at the top, but down below, ordinary people were just trying to survive, avoid getting caught in a crossfire, pay their dues, keep their heads down, and if you were really lucky, maybe you didn't end up on a battlefield in armor 2 sizes too big. Let's not forget the church in all this. The clergy tried their best to make sense of the king's condition in spiritual terms. It was a mirror held up to the fragility of power, the humanity inside the crown, and the heartbreaking truth that even kings can be broken. He was a ruler who didn't conquer or inspire, but he made people look twice. He made them wonder what happens when the highest seat in the land becomes a cage and the man inside forgets who he is. Charles VI didn't just lose his mind, he lost his kingdom. And yet, he gained something oddly rare in medieval history. He became unforgettable. Let's step away from the battlefield, the treaties, and the court intrigue for a moment. Let's go into the palace itself, into the daily reality of living alongside a monarch who could be charming at breakfast, catatonic by lunch, and convinced he was a vegetable by dinner. There's a story, passed down more like a legend, about how Charles VI once believed he had been turned into a turnip. Yes, a turnip. The court physician, a poor man who probably deserved a pension and a vacation in Italy, was summoned to reverse the spell. He tried to reason with Charles. He tried prayer. He even tried symbolic rituals to restore the king's humanity. Nothing worked. For 2 whole days, the king refused to speak, walk, or do anything but sit quietly in a chair muttering, "I am rooted." That was the rhythm of life in the palace. The staff, those loyal, overworked servants, had to treat him with the same deference they'd show to a fully functioning monarch. They bowed, addressed him formally, and kept the curtains drawn when he asked, even if it was 3 in the afternoon, and the sun was their only heating system. No one dared challenge him, even in his most unhinged moments. Whom? Because he was still the king. And in medieval France, kingship wasn't just a bit. It was sacred. One poor attendant was dismissed. No, banished, for sneezing too loudly during one of Charles's glass moods. He thought the sound had cracked his spine, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. In fact, some people in the palace grew fond of the king's eccentricities. They saw in him a certain innocence. After all, he never ordered mass executions. He wasn't cruel. He didn't thirst for power or glory. He just wanted to pet the dogs, wear velvet robes, and occasionally declare that B were royal messengers. Compared to some rulers of the time, that was practically enlightened. There were days when Charles would sit in the garden, humming quietly, offering breadcrumbs to birds. He'd smile at children. He'd tell stories to the palace cooks about imaginary adventures with sea creatures. And when those rare days came, the entire palace breathed easier. In a strange way, his madness created moments of strange peace. No one was sure how to rule in his name, so they often didn't. In those quiet stretches, Francis sort of held its breath, waiting, hoping, failing, but not falling apart completely. It was almost as if the kingdom, like the king, was learning to live with instability. There's another lesser-known tale. One night, Charles disappeared again. Panic set in. Guards searched every room, every hallway. Hours passed. Finally, they found him, huddled in the royal library, surrounded by scrolls, whispering to the painted saints in the manuscripts. When they tried to move him, he protested gently. "They're telling me how to fix the world." Was it madness? Or was it clarity wrapped in delusion? One of his aides once said, "He sees too much. Not what we see, but what lies beneath it. And it's driving him away." And maybe that was true. Maybe Charles wasn't mad in the way people feared. Dangerous, violent, evil. Maybe he was just sensitive in a world that had no room for softness. A king born into the worst possible time, with a mind too fragile for the weight of a crown forged in blood and steel. It's ironic, isn't it, that in an age defined by conquest and cruelty, the most feared thing about Charles was not what he did, but what he couldn't do. He couldn't be ruthless. He couldn't lead armies. He couldn't command loyalty with an iron fist. Instead, he wandered barefoot through his palace, searching for peace in a world that demanded chaos. And somewhere in all that madness was a strange kind of humanity. Let's take a moment to talk about the people behind the throne, the ones who propped up the illusion of power, while the real king hummed to pigeons in the garden. It's easy to forget, but no monarch rules alone. Behind every crown is a small army of advisors, clerks, bodyguards, and, most importantly, spin doctors. And during Charles VI's reign, those spin doctors were working overtime. One of the most influential figures was Jean de Montague, the king's treasurer. He was the kind of man who could smile while draining your budget and still get invited to dinner. Montague spent most of his career trying to patch the holes in the kingdom's finances with duct tape made of taxes and favors. But even he couldn't account for the cost of a monarch who might declare a national holiday for birds or insist on replacing court uniforms with matching pajamas. Then there were the doctors. Oh, the poor doctors. Medieval medicine wasn't exactly scientific. Charles's physicians would rotate between bleeding, purging, chanting, and occasionally rubbing herbs on his temples while muttering Latin under their breath. One report describes a physician tying a bundle of lavender and garlic around the king's ankle to expel the demon of confusion. It didn't work, unless the demon of confusion really liked the smell of soup. Despite the madness, Charles did have moments of startling awareness, and when they came, he demanded to know what had happened during his absence. Advisors would tiptoe around the truth, like parents explaining to a child why the goldfish now lives on a farm. They couldn't very well say, "Well, Your Majesty, while you were insisting you were a teacup, your cousin declared civil war, and your wife signed a treaty handing the throne to England. So instead, they nodded, smiled, and prayed he'd forget again before asking for a report. One of the most surreal moments came when Charles asked to address the court in full regalia. He dressed in ceremonial armor, completely inappropriate for the occasion, and stood silently for 10 minutes before declaring, "The fish in the moat have betrayed me." Then he sat down and fell asleep. And you know what? They applauded, because in the kingdom of the blind, even a sleeping king was better than no king at all. Let's not forget the people outside the palace walls, the common folk, the merchants, the farmers. They weren't reading royal decrees or following court gossip. They were trying to survive. And to them, the madness of Charles was both terrifying and oddly comforting. Why comforting? Because in a world of unpredictable rulers, Charles's lunacy was at least consistent. He wasn't burning villages for sport. He wasn't raising taxes just to build golden statues of himself. He was just broken. And in a weird way, people could relate to that. Life was hard. The world was harsh. And here was their king, wandering around with twigs in his hair, talking about invisible insects, just as confused as everyone else. Some even saw him as holy, a suffering king, chosen by God to bear the weight of sin and sorrow. There were whispers that touching the hem of his robe could bring healing. Pilgrims came to see him, not as a ruler, but as a relic. Others, of course, weren't so kind. Satirical songs spread across the countryside, mocking the king's condition. One popular verse went, "O glassy king with silver crown, he cracks each time he sits down." Cruel? Yes. But it speaks to the strange relationship people had with their monarch. He was a punchline, a mystery, a warning, and a symbol all at once. Even outside France, Charles's condition was famous. Foreign envoys would return home with wild stories about the king who couldn't be touched, or the royal court that treated madness like routine paperwork. It became a diplomatic challenge. How do you negotiate with a crown that might believe you're a duck? Still, the kingdom held together, barely, through the grit of the people, through the cunning of the court, and somehow through the fractured, flickering presence of a man who never really got to be a king, but never stopped being human. By now, you might be wondering, was Charles V just a tragic outlier, a bizarre blip in the timeline of kings? Or was there something deeper at work, something systemic? Because when a ruler goes mad, it's not just a personal problem. It becomes a national identity crisis. France didn't just have a mad king. It was a kingdom ruled by that madness. In many ways, the entire nation began to reflect the erratic, unstable behavior of its monarch. One year, you'd have peace negotiations. The next, civil war. One week, a noble would be declared regent. The next, he'd be poisoned at a banquet. The very structure of French politics started to mirror the chaos inside Charles's mind. Let's take a look at the royal court itself. It wasn't just nobles in robes sipping wine. It was a pressure cooker of ambition and fear. You had men like Bernard VII of Armagnac, ruthless, brilliant, utterly convinced that only he could save France. He built a power base so large it rivaled the monarchy itself. Then there was John the Fearless, the Duke of Burgundy, whose nickname wasn't just for show. He survived assassination attempts, launched brutal revenge campaigns, and basically ran northern France like a medieval CEO with a grudge. And what about Charles? He sat in the middle of all this, sometimes watching, sometimes mumbling about the moon being too judgmental. It was theater, absurd, dangerous theater. The court would often prepare two sets of speeches, one for the days Charles was lucid, one for the days he wasn't. Imagine trying to run a country where your policy depends on whether or not your king woke up thinking he was a goat. Eventually, the nobles stopped trying to fix Charles. They started using him. Need a law passed? Wait for a lucid day. Or better yet, forge a signature and claim he was very enthusiastic about the decision. Need to rally support? Parade the king through the streets in full regalia, carefully coached to smile and wave before wheeling him back inside like a puppet in storage. But this kind of manipulation had a price. The longer Charles remained on the throne, the more the public began to question everything. Was that royal decree real? Was that tax hike legitimate? Was the war with England necessary, or just a distraction from the chaos inside the court? People started to lose faith not just in the king, but in kingship itself. This erosion of trust would echo for generations. It planted the seeds for revolutions, rebellions, and a growing belief that maybe, just maybe, power should belong to the people, not to a single man in a crown who might decide his shoelaces are conspiring against him. And then came the children. Charles had several. The most notable was the Dauphin, the future Charles VII. But growing up in a palace where your father might call you a demon or accuse you of stealing his dreams, that leaves a mark. Young Charles VII spent much of his youth unsure if he would ever rule. His legitimacy was constantly questioned. Thanks to the Treaty of Troyes, some thought he was a bastard. Others thought he was cursed. And all of this was Charles VI's legacy, an inheritance not just of blood, but of doubt, paranoia, and broken trust. Still, despite it all, some people continued to hope that the madness would lift, that the kingdom would stabilize, that maybe, just maybe, Charles would return, not the broken, glass-obsessed figure shuffling through the halls, but the bright young king from decades before, the one who had once spoken of peace and prosperity. But time doesn't reverse, and madness, once it takes hold, rarely lets go. Even in his final years, Charles remained unpredictable. One moment, he'd speak with eerie clarity about military tactics. The next, he'd demand that the court musicians play the same song on repeat for 8 hours straight because the squirrels asked for it. And the court, they played it every single time. Because when your king believes in singing squirrels, you learn to keep the flutes warm. Now, let's talk about memory. How a man like Charles VI ends up being remembered. Because when the dust settles and the wars fade into history books, what sticks? The crown? The madness? Or the stories that get passed around dinner tables for generations? In Charles's case, it's all of the above. To some, he was a punchline, the glass king, the man who thought he'd shatter if touched. To others, a tragic symbol of a nation adrift. And to a select few, mostly poets and priests, he was a misunderstood soul, trapped in a world that demanded steel when all he had was sand. Let's not forget the irony of it all. Charles ruled longer than many kings, before and after him, over 40 years. That's not just a reign, it's an era. A whole generation grew up, lived, and died under a king who spent large portions of his life believing he wasn't a king at all. But for all his instability, he left behind one of the most chaotic, fascinating legacies in French history. After his death in 1422, the throne didn't pass smoothly. The Treaty of Troyes said Henry V of England would inherit it. Problem was, Henry V had already died, so now you had a dead French king, a dead English king, and a royal mess. Enter baby Henry, an infant who, in theory, ruled both England and France. Meanwhile, Charles VI's son, the disinherited Charles VII, said, I think I'll be king anyway. France now had two kings again, one in a crib in London, the other a paranoid 20-something with a questionable claim and a fractured realm. It would take years, decades, of fighting to resolve that mess, and Charles VI's long, troubled rule was the cracked foundation beneath it all. Let's zoom in again, just for a second. Not on the politics, on the man. What do you do with a monarch who has visions of talking dogs and fears that the moon is laughing at him? Do you lock him away? Do you hide him from public view? Do you pretend he's fine while the kingdom slowly implodes? The French did all of that, and yet they also tried to love him. There are records of servants comforting him during his worst episodes, of nurses sitting beside him, singing softly while he ranted about imaginary invasions. One attendant recalled how Charles, in a rare moment of peace, took her hand and whispered, "Do you think God made me wrong?" That line sticks, because it reminds us that beyond the robes, the rituals, and the royal madness, there was still a man terrified of his own mind, a man aware, on some level, that he was broken, and that breaks you a little too, doesn't it? We often think of kings as symbols of strength, of power, of order. Charles shattered that illusion. He was weak, he was lost, and yet he endured, not as a conqueror or a lawgiver, but as a warning, a riddle, a reflection. Today, historians still debate his condition. Was it schizophrenia? Bipolar disorder? Some rare neurological disease worsened by stress and trauma? There are no easy answers, just fragments, court records, letters, eyewitness accounts, scattered across the centuries like pieces of a broken mirror. And when we try to reassemble that mirror, what we see is more than just a king. We see the fragility of power, the thin line between reverence and ridicule, and a man who, for all his flaws, held a nation's fate in his trembling hands. They called him Charles the Mad. But madness is never just madness, is it? Sometimes it's grief. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's the only response a person can muster in a world that refuses to make sense. And in Charles's case, maybe it was all of the above. By this point, you might be thinking, Charles was mad. But was there nothing redeemable about his reign? And fair question, because despite everything, despite the hallucinations, the glass delusions, the sausage shop escapades, Charles VI's reign wasn't entirely a lost cause. In fact, some surprisingly progressive changes happened on his watch. Not because he was directly responsible, mind you. Most of them occurred during his moments of absence. But still, history has a funny way of crediting whoever's on the throne when stuff gets done. For one, the French legal system began to solidify under his reign. Royal ordinances started becoming more structured and consistent, mostly thanks to advisors who were tired of the king trying to outlaw too many frogs in the fountain. Universities gained prestige. Paris became a cultural center again, despite everything going on in the palace. And the idea that kings were not above the law, while not yet fully embraced, began to creep into public consciousness. There was even a bizarre kind of freedom that grew out of his instability. Because with a king who wasn't paying attention, people in the lower levels of power started experimenting. Mayors, bishops, and nobles began managing their regions more independently. Some abused that power, sure, but others used it wisely. You could argue that the early seeds of local governance, the idea that not everything must come from the top, were planted during the reign of a man who often forgot he was even wearing pants. And then there was art. You might not expect it, but Charles's court was a patron of the arts, albeit indirectly. With politics on pause and the crown constantly distracted, artists and writers found more room to breathe. Illuminated manuscripts flourished. Poets wrote ballads not just of heroic deeds, but of sorrow, madness, and the fallibility of man. Sound familiar? One of the most famous works of the time was Le Livre des Folies, the Book of Follies, a poetic commentary that directly mocked the absurdities of court life. It was biting, hilarious, and incredibly bold for its time. Under a more brutal king, the author would have been executed. Under Charles, the king probably thought it was a bedtime story written by the furniture, and in that strange cultural space, creativity bloomed. But perhaps the most redeeming legacy of Charles VI wasn't something he built or decreed. It was the reminder of what unchecked power could look like, and how a kingdom learns to survive in spite of it. His son, Charles VII, would later rise to power in defiance of the Treaty of Troyes. He had seen firsthand the cost of instability. He'd lived through the betrayal, the courtly lies, the helplessness of watching his father slip further into a fractured reality. And when he finally took the throne, he did it not just with an army, but with the burning desire to never repeat the past. And speaking of armies, let's not forget Joan of Arc. Yes, that Joan. Her rise was deeply tied to Charles VII's struggle to reclaim legitimacy after his father's disastrous rule. In fact, many French people saw Joan's appearance as divine balance, God sending sanity to restore what madness had taken. Charles VI's legacy, whether he knew it or not, had paved the path for her to become a legend. So no, his reign wasn't entirely darkness. It was a storm, but like all storms, it brought change. Still, the man himself faded into the background of his own story. As his final years wore on, Charles became more ghost than king. He wandered the halls silently. He sometimes refused to eat. Other times, he'd stand at the window for hours, watching the clouds, murmuring names no one recognized. Every once in a while, he'd call out for his younger self, as if he believed that boy, the bright-eyed prince with dreams of peace, might still come back and sit beside him. He never did. But in those final moments, Charles wasn't surrounded by nobles or guards or warlords. He was held by a nurse, a woman who'd been caring for him since he first thought he was made of glass. She said his last words were soft, gentle. "I'm not broken. I'm just tired." And then silence. Not the dramatic, kingdom-shaking kind. Just the soft, inevitable ending of a man who never truly ruled, but somehow still mattered. So, how do you tell the story of a king who ruled for over 4 decades without ever really being in control? Charles V remains one of history's greatest paradoxes. A monarch who lost his grip on reality yet clung to the throne. A ruler feared by some, pitied by many, and understood by almost no one. His life was a tapestry woven with confusion, fragility, and moments of strange, flickering clarity, and yet we still talk about him, not because of his laws or his wars, but because he was real, painfully, undeniably human. That's a rare thing in royal history. Kings are often remembered as symbols of strength, conquest, tyranny, but Charles was remembered for being lost, and in a way that made him more relatable than any conqueror. Let's not sugarcoat it. His reign was a disaster. France nearly tore itself in half. Civil war erupted. The English gained ground, and the monarchy's reputation plummeted. But from the wreckage of his rule, something new emerged. A stronger understanding that power must have balance. That one man, no matter how noble or sacred, can't bear the weight of a nation alone. It was a painful lesson, but one that echoed through history. After his death, the image of the Mad King became a warning. His name was invoked in whispers every time a monarch began to lose touch with reality. His story was studied, dissected, even mocked, yet never forgotten. Centuries later, playwrights would borrow from his legacy. You can see echoes of Charles VI in Shakespeare's King Lear, in the unraveling of sanity and the tragic beauty of a man fighting against his own mind. And in modern psychology, his condition became a case study, long before anyone could properly diagnose schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or delusional psychosis. It's strange, isn't it, that a man who spent entire days believing he was made of glass could leave such a clear impression on the world. But let's go back one more time, to the beginning. Charles wasn't born broken. He was a boy raised in a golden cage, groomed to lead, crowned too early, surrounded by wolves in velvet. He tried. He really did. In his early years, he was brave, diplomatic, even visionary. But pressure cracks the strongest stone, and Charles, soft, sensitive, and likely predisposed to mental illness, wasn't built for the crushing weight of medieval kingship. So he escaped. Not physically, but mentally. While others fought for his crown, he wandered his palace chasing butterflies. While his advisors schemed, he named the chairs in his bedroom. While armies marched, he wept over imaginary bruises no one could see. And maybe that's why we remember him, because there's something hauntingly familiar in the way he broke. Haven't we all, at some point, wanted to disappear, to slip away from responsibility, pressure, expectation? Charles just did it all the way. He became the king who was too human to be king. That's not to say he didn't leave pain behind. His madness fractured families. His inaction cost lives. His reign, or lack thereof, led to some of the darkest years in French history. But he didn't do it out of malice. He didn't do it for power. He simply couldn't not be who he was. There's a kind of poetry in that. And so, his story doesn't end with a great battle or a sweeping victory. It ends with a quiet sigh, a long sleep, and a kingdom learning to rebuild itself from the pieces left behind. Charles VI didn't change the world, but he changed how we see kings, not as gods, not as infallible, but as fragile, flawed, and sometimes beautifully broken. Let's end where all stories eventually lead, at the legacy, not the political one, not the treaties or the lines on a map, but the human one, the memory that lingers in the quiet spaces between facts. Because Charles VI's story, for all its absurdity and heartbreak, is ultimately about what happens when power meets fragility. He wasn't the only ruler to lose his mind. History is full of monarchs who cracked under pressure, but Charles is unique, not just because he lost his grip on reality, but because the entire kingdom kept pretending he hadn't. They dressed him, sat him on the throne, fed him meals he barely noticed. They built a palace of denial around him so carefully that for decades, the illusion almost held. That's what makes his story so haunting. It wasn't just one man's descent. It was an entire system's refusal to let go. And yet, hidden in all of this tragedy is something quietly powerful. Endurance. Charles endured. Not heroically, not with speeches or swords, but he endured through decades of hallucinations, betrayals, and political games. He lived on when his rivals fell. He watched kingdoms rise and collapse through a fog of confusion and fear. And somehow, even through the madness, he managed to hold on to a sliver of humanity. There's a moment, documented in a dusty court record, when Charles, during a brief moment of clarity, was asked what he feared most. He didn't say war, or death, or treason. He said, that I will forget who I am. And isn't that the most human fear of all? That we'll become strangers to ourselves. That we'll drift so far from our sense of identity, purpose, or reality that even our own reflection feels unfamiliar. Charles lived that nightmare, day after day, year after year, but he also gave us something rare, a king who reminded the world that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, strength is surviving when you don't even understand why you're still here. After his death in 1422, there was no grand funeral march, no epic poems written in his honor. France moved on quickly. Too quickly, some said. His son, Charles VII, would eventually rise to power with the help of Joan of Arc and rebuild the fractured nation from the ashes of his father's reign. But the memory of Charles lingered, not in glory, not in victory, in whispers, in old songs, in paintings where his eyes seemed just a little too far away, in bedtime stories about the king who thought he was glass, in scholarly texts that debate what illness claimed him, in quiet museum corners where his name is etched in gold beside names of men who shaped the world by force. And maybe that's the lesson. Not all rulers shape history by wielding power. Some shape it by forcing the world to reckon with what happens when power fails. When we study Charles VI, we're not just studying a king. We're studying ourselves, our fear of losing control, our discomfort with vulnerability, our instinct to hide what we don't understand, and maybe, if we're honest, our fascination with those who fall apart in public. Because there's a strange, magnetic beauty in watching someone navigate madness with no roadmap, a reminder that even the most broken among us still leave behind echoes. Charles this didn't leave behind an empire. He didn't write manifestos or lead revolutions. He left behind a question. What does it mean to lead when you can barely lead yourself? And maybe that's enough. Because sometimes survival is the most powerful story of all. The first computer was built in the 1800s, but nobody understood it. You ever hear of a machine so ahead of its time that the world just shrugged? I mean, imagine inventing a smartphone in the year Napoleon was still stomping around Europe, and people just calling it a fancy abacus. That's basically what happened in the early 1800s with the first real computer, built not out of silicon chips or plastic keys, but brass cogs and iron rods. It was clunky, loud, and steampunk as hell, but it worked. The kicker? Almost no one knew what to do with it. Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let me set the scene. Imagine you're in London around 1822. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. Coal smoke fills the air. Steam engines are the height of technology. And gentlemen still wear top hats even while solving math problems. It's a world buzzing with invention, and yet completely unprepared for what one man was about to drop into it. That man was Charles Babbage, a name that should be right up there with Newton, Einstein, or Jobs, but isn't. Why? Because Babbage's greatest invention, the difference engine, was just too brilliant for its own good. Babbage was a mathematician, philosopher, inventor, and something of a curmudgeon. The kind of guy who didn't suffer fools, and definitely didn't suffer government bureaucrats, which, as you'll see, would be a bit of a problem. So, what exactly was this difference engine? Think of it as a mechanical calculator the size of a piano. Its job? To crank out mathematical tables. Those big, tedious lists of numbers used in navigation, engineering, and astronomy. Back then, those tables were handwritten by armies of clerks, and they were full of errors. Mistakes in navigation tables, for instance, could send a ship hundreds of miles off course. Babbage figured, why trust a human when a machine could do it better? He envisioned a device that would automatically compute and print these tables with perfect accuracy. And this wasn't just a pipe dream. He actually built a small prototype that worked. People were intrigued. The British government even tossed him some funding. But as the project grew, so did the costs, the delays, and the confusion. You see, Babbage wasn't just building a calculator. He was inching towards something far more complex, a programmable computer. His vision kept evolving. First, it was the difference engine. Then came the analytical engine, which could, in theory, do any calculation. It had memory, a CPU-like system, even punched cards. Used a century later in early 20th century computing. But here's the twist. The tech was too far ahead for the era. The engineers didn't quite understand how to build it. The government didn't understand what they were paying for. And Babbage? He was terrible at explaining himself in plain English. To the public, it looked like an eccentric tinkerer burning through taxpayer money with nothing to show but a mountain of gears. And to be fair, there was a lot of brass involved. The parts were handcrafted, precision engineering in a time when precision was still kind of optional. The British government eventually pulled the plug, and the project was left in limbo. Babbage died in TISA-1, frustrated, brilliant, and largely forgotten. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but if nobody understood it back then, why should I care now? Because here's the kicker. Babbage basically designed the architecture for modern computers before electricity was even in common use. His ideas were rediscovered, revered, and even physically built in the 1990s by the Science Museum in London. And guess what? It worked. The machine did exactly what Babbage said it would, 150 years earlier. So yeah, this story is about more than gears and math. It's about what happens when someone sees the future, clear as day. But the rest of the world is still stuck in the past. Over the next 11 parts, we're going to unpack that world, follow Babbage's journey, meet the geniuses and politicians around him, and maybe, just maybe, see why history took so long to catch up. Because this isn't just a story about a machine. It's a story about missed chances, misunderstood brilliance, and the absurd reality that the first computer could have existed before the light bulb. Let's rewind a little and get to know the man behind the machine. Charles Babbage wasn't your average Victorian gentleman. Sure, he had the beard, the stiff collars, and the air of someone who probably carried a pocket watch, but Babbage also had a brain that never slept. As a child, he read math books for fun. Not picture books, not fairy tales, math books. That should tell you everything. By the time he entered Cambridge University, he was already miles ahead of his peers, literally correcting the textbooks he was being taught from. He and a group of equally nerdy friends founded the Analytical Society, whose mission was to reform how calculus was taught in Britain. Yep, a student club for rebranding calculus. That was their idea of rebellion. But Babbage wasn't just an academic hermit. He had a wild curiosity and a very real anger toward inefficiency. It drove him mad that the mathematical tables used across industries, tables used to calculate interest, navigate ships, design bridges, were riddled with errors, and these weren't harmless typos. A misplaced digit could sink a ship or collapse a bridge. So Babbage's quest wasn't just intellectual, it was practical. He wanted to replace unreliable human labor with reliable machine logic. And so, in 1822, the seed of the difference engine was planted. Babbage submitted a paper to the Royal Astronomical Society describing a machine that could compute polynomial functions using only addition, no multiplication or division required. It would do this through a clever mathematical trick called the method of finite differences. Sounds complicated, but in layman's terms, it allowed the machine to crunch out complex tables without breaking a mechanical sweat. The paper caught attention. The government, always eager to fund anything that might improve navigation, and thus the Royal Navy, gave him a grant of $1,500. That might not sound like much, but in today's money, we're talking hundreds of thousands of pounds. Babbage hired skilled engineers and craftsmen and set to work. That's when the gears, both literal and metaphorical, started grinding. See, building a prototype is one thing. Scaling that prototype to industrial size, another story entirely. Every single quo had to be custom made. We're talking components machined to a tolerance of thousandths of an inch. in a world where most manufacturing still relied on hand tools. It was precision work without the benefit of mass production. Babbage worked with one of the best engineers of his time, Joseph Clement, who actually could produce the kind of parts Babbage needed. But Clement demanded his own workshop and funding for it, wanted to work only from his home, and had a perfectionist streak that rivaled Babbage's. Soon, costs ballooned, delays piled up, and the government started asking awkward questions like, "Where is this thing we paid for?" Meanwhile, Babbage, ever the visionary, was beginning to lose interest in the difference engine altogether. Around 1834, he had a bigger, bolder idea: the analytical engine. If the difference engine was a calculator, the analytical engine was a computer, a full-blown, general-purpose computing machine. It had an arithmetic logic unit, memory, which he called the store, a processing unit, the mill, and even input/output via punched cards, adapted from looms used in the textile industry. This thing was the real deal. There was just one problem, or rather several. The technology to build it didn't exist yet. It would have required even finer tolerances, more funding, and a world that wasn't ready for what Babbage was selling. Still, Babbage worked on the plans obsessively. He lectured, published, and designed. But nobody truly understood what he was trying to achieve. He might as well have been explaining the internet to a bunch of horse and buggy drivers. It's at this point that you start to feel for the guy. Imagine having a dream so vivid, so complete, that you can see it in your sleep. But every time you try to describe it, people stare at you like you've got a cog loose. That was Babbage's reality. And yet, somehow, amid all this technical brilliance and social oblivion, one person did understand him, a woman named Ada Lovelace. But more on her next time, because if Babbage was the mind, Ada was the spark. Let's talk about Ada Lovelace. If Charles Babbage was the inventor of the machine, Ada was the one who saw its soul. Born Augusta Ada Byron in 1815. Yes, as in the daughter of Lord Byron, the scandalous poet, she was raised on a steady diet of mathematics and logic by her mother, who was determined to scrub any trace of her father's romantic madness from Ada's DNA. Little did she know, she'd raise one of the most visionary minds of the 19th century. Ada was brilliant, like scary brilliant. She took to mathematics like a duck to water. By her teens, she was working with some of the top scientists and mathematicians of the era. And in 1833, when she was just 17, she met Charles Babbage. That meeting changed everything. For both of them, Babbage gave her a demo of the difference engine. Remember, this was a prototype machine made of brass, designed to compute and print tables automatically. To most people, it looked like a giant, confusing pile of gears. But Ada, she didn't just understand it. She saw it. Not just what it did, but what it could do. Their friendship blossomed over letters, discussions, and mutual admiration. Ada became more than just a fan. She became a collaborator. In 1842, the Italian mathematician Luigi Menabrea wrote a paper in French about Babbage's analytical engine. Ada was asked to translate it into English. But what she did was far more than a translation. Her version included a series of detailed footnotes. So detailed, in fact, that her notes were longer than the original paper. Within these notes, She described how the analytical engine could be used to calculate Bernoulli numbers. More importantly, she outlined the concept of a loop, a foundational idea in computer science. That's right. She wrote the first algorithm ever intended to be carried out by a machine. In doing so, Ada essentially became the world's first computer programmer. But it wasn't just the math. Ada grasped something that even Babbage hadn't fully expressed. She wrote that the analytical engine could go beyond numbers, that it could manipulate symbols, compose music, and create art, provided the rules were known. In essence, she predicted general-purpose computing more than a century before it became real. Let that sink in. While most of the world couldn't even wrap its head around mechanical math tables, Ada saw artificial intelligence on the horizon. She wasn't dreaming wildly. She was projecting forward with pure logic. Sadly, the world wasn't ready for her either. Ada's contributions were largely ignored for years. After all, she was a woman in the 1800s, talking about machines that didn't exist yet. Babbage adored her work and her mind, but the scientific community just didn't take her seriously. She died tragically young, at age 36, from cancer. But her legacy would outlive her. Today, the programming language Ada is named in her honor, and she's rightly remembered as a pioneer not just of computing, but of modern thought. Her collaboration with Babbage was one of history's great intellectual partnerships. Where he saw mechanics, she saw meaning. He built the engine, she envisioned the future, and together, they dreamed of a machine that wouldn't exist until the world finally caught up. But what if they'd been born a century later? What if Babbage had access to electricity, microchips, or even just better tools? Would the computing age have started in the Victorian era? That's the question we'll dig into next, as we look at the strange world that surrounded them. A world teetering between horse-drawn carriages and digital dreams. Now, before you start imagining steam-powered laptops and Victorian nerds playing Pong with pocket watches, let's ground ourselves in the reality of the time. Because while Babbage and Ada were dreaming up machines that would one day change the world they lived in was deeply unprepared. The 19th century was a weird, transitional phase, technologically explosive, but fundamentally uneven. You had locomotives thundering across the countryside, while doctors still thought leeches were a solid medical plan. Telegraph lines were being strung up while most people couldn't even read. It was a world caught between past and future, dragging its feet into modernity. And into this half-lit world walked Charles Babbage with blueprints for a machine that made almost no sense to anyone else. Even the people who funded the difference engine didn't totally get what they were paying for. The British government thought they were backing a better way to print navigation tables. Fair enough. But when Babbage pivoted to the analytical engine, the whole project lost its footing. Instead of refining one machine, he was now pitching an entirely new, and even more complex one. To the government, it probably felt like funding a bridge, only to have the engineer say, "Actually, I'd rather build a flying boat instead." Add to that Babbage's personality, and things got dicey. He wasn't exactly a diplomat. He had no patience for bureaucracy, and even less for people he considered intellectually inferior, which unfortunately was most of them. His letters to government officials are legendary for their passive-aggressive jabs and mathematical smugness, and so funding dried up. Joseph Clement, the engineer responsible for the actual construction, parted ways with Babbage over money and control. Progress stalled. Machines half-built gathered dust in workshops. The world went on, blissfully unaware of what it was leaving behind. But this wasn't just a case of bad timing or poor communication. The core issue was that the ideas Babbage and Lovelace introduced had no place to land. The language of computing didn't exist yet. There were no tech magazines, no universities offering computer science, no venture capitalists looking for the next big thing. In data crunching, they were alone. And that kind of loneliness is hard to appreciate today. In our world, we get hyped about the latest phone because we've already lived through decades of digital evolution. We expect progress, but in 885, progress was still measured in inches, not leaps. The analytical engine wasn't just a technological marvel, it was a philosophical threat. It questioned what machines were for. Could they think? Could they learn? Could they replace humans? These are the kinds of questions that keep us up at night now. Back then, they were dismissed outright, or worse, ignored. What makes the story even more haunting is how close Babbage came. The components he designed were not fantasy. They were mechanically viable. When the Science Museum in London finally built a complete difference engine in 1991 using his original plans, it worked flawlessly, not sort of, not if you squint. It worked exactly as Babbage said it would. It was a stunning vindication, 150 years too late. That's the punchline of this entire story. Babbage didn't fail because he was wrong. He failed because he was right in the wrong century. And the cost of that failure? Well, we'll never really know. But consider this. If his analytical engine had been completed, if Ada Lovelace's programs had run, if the ideas of general-purpose computing had taken hold, we might have seen the digital revolution begin in the 1850s. Electricity might have come second. Think about that. Computers before light bulbs. Of course, history doesn't work that way. The world wasn't ready. The gears turned too slowly. And the people who could have changed everything were buried before the world ever realized what they'd built. In the next part, we'll dive into the forgotten figures who did pick up where Babbage left off, and why it took over 100 years before anyone could really follow the blueprint. By the time the 20th century rolled around, Babbage and Lovelace were mostly footnotes, quirky figures in the dusty halls of history. The world had moved on. Telegraphs had come and gone. Telephones were starting to buzz in homes. Electricity was finally lighting up cities. And computers? They were still science fiction. But every now and then, someone would stumble across Babbage's work and have their mind blown. One of those people was Howard Aiken, a Harvard mathematician and physicist. In the 1930s, while working on complex equations for electrical engineering, Aiken found himself buried in hand calculations. He needed a machine, a better way to handle the endless tides of numbers. Sound familiar? While researching possible solutions, Aiken came across Babbage's analytical engine. He was stunned. This Victorian-era madman had already mapped out the key components of a computing machine. Components Aiken had assumed were modern inventions. So what did Aiken do? He ran with it. With backing from IBM, Aiken helped build the Harvard Mark I in the early 1940s. It was a massive electromechanical computer, a behemoth the size of a room, using telephone switches and punch cards to perform calculations. It was the great-great-grandchild of the analytical engine, and unlike Babbage's machines, The Mark I actually got built. It was used during World War II to calculate artillery trajectories and other military data. It wasn't lightning fast by today's standards, but it was reliable. It could crank out answers tirelessly, exactly as Babbage had envisioned. And here's the kicker. Aiken made no bones about where his inspiration came from. He openly credited Babbage as the true pioneer of computing. It was a delayed but heartfelt recognition, a nod across a century to a man whose ideas had finally found a home. But while Aiken brought Babbage's dream into the physical world, it was another figure who truly unleashed the potential of computing, Alan Turing. If Babbage was the grandfather of the computer, Turing was the rebellious genius teenager who redefined what that meant. In the 1960s and 1940s, Turing developed the theoretical foundations of modern computing. His concept of a universal machine, a single machine capable of simulating any other machine, laid the groundwork for every computer that would follow. And you better believe Turing knew about Babbage too. In fact, when asked about the origins of computing, Turing once wryly remarked, "Babbage gave the idea of a universal machine, but not the means of implementing it." Still, Turing was haunted by some of the same frustrations. During World War II, he helped crack the Nazi Enigma code, arguably one of the most important contributions to the Allied victory. But much like Babbage, his own government didn't fully grasp the scale of his genius. He died young, under tragic circumstances, persecuted for his sexuality. Two men, 2 centuries, one shared curse, seeing the future too clearly, too soon. And yet, thanks to them, and thanks to Ada Lovelace, who had predicted many of these concepts long before, they laid the bedrock of the digital age. When the first electronic computers, like ENIAC, appeared in the late 1940s, they didn't need gears or cranks anymore. They used vacuum tubes and electricity, but conceptually, they followed a path laid out by Babbage's mill and store, and Ada's looped algorithms. Here's the weird part. Even by the 1950s, many engineers still didn't fully appreciate how far back their field really went. To most, computing started with the war. Babbage and Lovelace were ancient curiosities. Their papers were hard to find. Their machines, long gone, never built. It would take the rise of computer science as an academic discipline to finally dust off their legacies and put them in the spotlight. In the next part, we'll explore how that rediscovery happened, how dusty manuscripts, half-finished models, and old correspondence re-emerged and reshaped our understanding of where the computer really came from. For a long time, Charles Babbage's ideas were scattered across old notebooks, obscure publications, and half-built brass contraptions locked away in museum archives. He wasn't exactly trending on 1950s Twitter, had it existed, but something strange happened as the 20th century rolled on. People started to care again, because the computer had arrived, and with it came a hunger to understand its roots. By the 1960s, universities around the world were building departments of computer science, a term that would have made Babbage beam. Historians and engineers alike started digging back through the history books to find out who really started all this. And guess whose name kept coming up? That's right, Charles Babbage. And right behind him, Ada Lovelace. One key moment in this rediscovery came in 19 squat. when Babbage's surviving papers, about 200 volumes, were finally catalogued by the British Library. These weren't just scribbles. They contained highly detailed diagrams, theoretical models, and design plans so precise that engineers could, with some effort, reconstruct the machines he had envisioned. At first, the idea of actually building one of Babbage's engines felt more like steampunk cosplay than serious science. But then, the Science Museum in London decided to give it a real shot. In 1991, using Babbage's original designs and only tools and methods available in his time, engineers constructed the difference engine number, a complete version of his most refined design, weighing nearly 5 tons, with thousands of moving parts. It stood as a monument to Victorian ambition. And here's the moment that gives you chills. It worked, flawlessly. The machine computed mathematical tables with perfect accuracy, just as Babbage had promised 150 years earlier. It wasn't just a piece of historical cosplay. It was proof. Babbage hadn't failed because the machine didn't work. He'd failed because no one gave him the time, money, or trust to finish it. And here's where the story gets downright poetic. To celebrate the 200th anniversary of Ada Lovelace's birth in 2015, a second difference engine was built and displayed. Her notes, once dismissed as poetic science by skeptics, were now revered as visionary. People who once laughed at the idea of a 19th century woman predicting software were now naming programming languages after her. It took a century and a half, but the world finally caught up. Historians began to reshape the narrative of computing. It wasn't just about Silicon Valleys and Cold War machines anymore. The story now stretched back to a mathematician obsessed with precision and a young woman who saw the soul in a machine. The legacy of Babbage and Lovelace now lives in every line of code, every smartphone, every server farm humming beneath our feet, not because they built the world's first working computer, but because they imagined it before anyone else could. And that raises a fascinating question. How many other Babbages are out there? Inventors who were too early, dreamers who wrote the future in a time that wasn't ready to read it. In the next chapter, we'll take a detour through history to meet some of those other forgotten visionaries, people who, like Babbage, built the impossible long before the world could understand it. Because while Charles may have been the first to sketch out a computer, he wasn't the only one to see the future too soon. History, it turns out, is full of Charles Babbages, people who imagined the future long before the world had the tools, the language, or frankly the curiosity to grasp it. And if we're going to understand just how revolutionary Babbage was, we need to look at some of these other lonely geniuses who also fell into the same trap, being right way too early. Let's start with Hero of Alexandria. No, not a video game character. An actual ancient Greek engineer who lived in the 1st century AD. Hero is most famous for creating the Lipial, a steam-powered spinning device. That's right. He built what's essentially the first known steam engine almost 1,700 years before James Watt. Did it revolutionize transportation? Did it power factories? Nope. It was used as a temple novelty to impress worshippers. The idea of using it for practical industry just didn't click at the time. Wrong century, wrong mindset. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and you'll find other Babbage types. There was Al-Jazari, a 12th century inventor in the Islamic Golden Age. who designed water-powered clocks, automata, mechanical robots, and even an early form of a crankshaft. Some of his devices were programmable, using pegs and cams to vary movement. Sound familiar? But again, these inventions were seen more as entertainment or marvels than stepping stones toward machines that think. Society wasn't ready. The context was missing. Then there's Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance poster boy for being ahead of his time. He sketched helicopters, tanks, and even what looked suspiciously like a mechanical calculator. He was arguably the Babbage of the 15th century, except he never built most of what he designed. Why? Because it was like trying to build a Tesla with medieval carpentry tools. And let's not forget J.H. Müller, a German engineer who, in 1786, decades before Babbage, proposed a machine for tabulating mathematical functions. But he lacked funding and, well, a Charles Babbage-type obsession to carry it through. What links all these people together is the same paradox: being too far ahead. When your ideas don't match your century's infrastructure, culture, or scientific knowledge, you get ignored. Or worse, laughed at. Babbage, at least, built part of his dream, and Ada Lovelace wrote it down. But history is littered with people who never even got that far. We remember Edison and Bell and Turing because their inventions landed at the right moment, when someone was ready to listen, and the tools existed to bring their ideas to life. That's part of why the Babbage story is so compelling. It forces us to ask, how many breakthroughs have we missed because we just weren't paying attention? How many innovations died in notebooks or workshops because their creators had no Ada to champion them and no audience to believe? Even today, we still grapple with this issue. Think about the early internet pioneers in the 1960s and 70s. Their vision of a connected world, full of digital collaboration and shared knowledge, was ignored, mocked, or buried in military research labs. It took another generation and a lot of luck before it became the internet you're using right now. In some ways, we've gotten better at spotting genius. We have venture capital, innovation labs, and billion-dollar tech startups chasing every wild idea. But the danger of being too soon still exists. You can have the perfect blueprint and still be met with blank stares. Which brings us back to Babbage. He didn't just invent a machine. He lived a truth that all inventors fear, that your greatest idea might arrive in a time incapable of understanding it. In the next section, we'll shift our focus back to the 21st century to examine just how far we've come since the days of brass gears and crank handles. And we'll ask the question, if Babbage walked into a modern computer lab today, what would he think? Spoiler, he might faint. Or he might just say, well, finally, let's say, just for fun, that we grab Charles Babbage by the lapels of time, yank him out of the 19th century, and drop him into a modern tech lab, say at MIT or Silicon Valley. What would he make of it? The blinking LEDs, glowing screens, the quiet hum of servers stacked like metal forests. He might assume he'd been abducted by aliens. But then someone hands him a smartphone. He watches it do math, send messages, track satellites in space, stream videos of sets playing piano. And maybe, just maybe, after the initial panic, he'd smile. Because beneath all the sci-fi sheen, he'd recognize something very familiar. Inside your phone is a processor that fetches instructions from memory, Babbage's store, carries out arithmetic, his mill, and stores results. It takes input, processes it, and gives you an output. In other words, a direct descendant of the analytical engine. And that's the real twist here. The machines we now take for granted follow principles Babbage mapped out with brass and brain power 2 centuries ago. The logic gates and microchips may look nothing like his crank-driven gears, but the architecture is eerily similar. In fact, Babbage might even be disappointed by some of it. Not the power, of course. Our devices are billions of times faster than anything he imagined. But the clarity. Today's systems are hidden in layers upon layers of abstraction. Coding has become less about direct machine interaction and more about gluing together frameworks. Babbage liked knowing exactly what every gear did. In a modern operating system, even the engineers barely know what all the gears are doing. He might admire the engineering, but he'd also probably ask, "Where's the diagram? How can I fix it if I don't understand it?" But beyond the machines themselves, the impact would thrill him. Computing has spread to every part of life. Medicine, education, finance, art, music, Ada's dream of machines that could compose. That's now reality. AI programs write symphonies and paint portraits. Code creates entire virtual worlds. The analytical engine, once just an idea, is now the backbone of human civilization. And yet, there's another side to this Babbage time travel fantasy. Imagine he starts asking questions. How long did it take for someone to build my engine after I died? Why did nobody finish it sooner? What happened to Ada's work? Why did it take over a century before anyone realized what we were doing? And that's where the celebration gets a little bittersweet. Because yes, we finally built the machines. Yes, we're living in the era he dreamed of. But we also ignored him for 150 years. His manuscripts gathered dust. Ada's work was dismissed as romantic fluff. The chance to kickstart the computer age in the 1800s was lost, simply because the world wasn't listening. It's a hard truth. Genius isn't always enough. Sometimes it needs the right moment, the right people, the right context. So what would Babbage think? Standing in the glowing light of the 21st century, maybe he'd laugh at how long it took. Maybe he'd try to explain something even more advanced. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd finally feel understood. Because the machines are here. The logic lives on. The dream survived. In the next part, we'll step away from fantasy and take a deep dive into one of the analytical engine's most powerful legacies. Its role in shaping not just machines, but the way we think about logic, process, and even creativity. Because while Babbage gave us the machine, what he really gave us was the blueprint for thinking like a computer, before computers even existed. When we talk about Babbage's legacy, it's easy to focus on the metal, the gears, levers, and elegantly tooled cogs of his difference and analytical engines. But maybe the most important thing he left behind wasn't a machine at all. It was a mindset, a radical new way of thinking about processes, logic, how work could be broken down into tiny, exact steps. That, in essence, is what computers do. They follow instructions, not vibes, not guesses, instructions. And that idea, that a machine could be given a list of operations, and if followed correctly, always produce the same result, wasn't common in Babbage's time. In fact, it was revolutionary. People back then were still figuring things out with trial and error, hunches, and plenty of human creativity, which, let's be honest, also meant a lot of mistakes. Ships went down because math tables had errors, bridges collapsed, bankers miscalculated interest. Babbage wanted none of that. He wanted certainty, and that required rules. His approach laid the groundwork for what we now call algorithmic thinking. Let's break that down for a second. Algorithmic thinking is the ability to take a complex task, like sorting a list, calculating an orbit, or even making a cup of tea, and break it down into a series of unambiguous steps. No skipping, no guessing, just clear, repeatable logic. Sounds simple? It's not. People are terrible at this. Try asking someone to explain how to tie a shoelace, or how to get to the store without saying, just go there. Most folks will stumble, skip steps, or use intuition. But a computer, or Babbage's engine, needs precision. That's why his machines were so mind-blowing. They weren't just calculators. They were instruction followers. Machines that didn't just do, but did exactly as told. And only that. This was the beginning of a mental shift. A shift from creative problem-solving to structured programming. And while Babbage's gears may have stayed in museums, his influence quietly seeped into every modern system we use today. Think about it. Every time you follow a recipe, debug a program, or even build a Lego set, you're engaging in this kind of thinking. So are engineers. So are project managers. So is that annoying coworker who insists on spreadsheets for everything. This is Babbage's ghost at work. And Ada Lovelace? She took this logic and saw something more. She realized that if a machine could follow steps for math, it could follow steps for anything. Music, symbols, patterns. She saw creativity in logic. That blend of poetry and precision is what modern computing is all about. Take generative AI, for example. Tools that can write, draw, compose, and create. At their core, they're still just executing instructions. Millions of steps. Billions, even. But those steps, when layered right, produce something that feels almost magical. That magic has a direct ancestral line to the analytical engine. It's no exaggeration to say that Babbage and Lovelace laid the philosophical foundation for the entire field of computer science. Their ideas helped inspire Alan Turing, who formalized algorithmic thinking in the 20th century with the concept of the Turing machine, a theoretical device that reads and writes data based on a set of rules. Sound familiar? Turing, in his quiet British way, was building off the mental scaffolding Babbage left behind. Even though the two were separated by almost a century, their visions were astonishingly aligned. A machine that could compute anything, if only you gave it the right rules. So, the next time you open a Google Doc, send a tweet, or play a video game, remember, you're standing on the shoulders of some truly misunderstood giants. And in the next section, we'll explore how their story, especially Ada's, was nearly erased altogether, and how the modern world finally gave them the credit they deserved. For decades, actually a century, the names Charles Babbage and Ada Lovelace floated around the margins of technological history. If they were mentioned at all, it was as curious trivia. Oh yes, there was some Victorian fellow who tinkered with gears. Or, didn't Lord Byron's daughter write about math or something? Their true legacy was buried. forgotten under the rising tides of electricity, silicon, and Cold War tech races. It's ironic, isn't it? The very people who invented the foundations of computing were nearly left behind by the thing they helped create. Let's focus on Ada for a moment, because her story was the more fragile one. In the male-dominated world of 19th century science, Ada Lovelace was dismissed, diminished, or entirely ignored. Her groundbreaking notes on the analytical engine were chalked up to women's flair, or worse, attributed entirely to Babbage. Many believed she was just a talented translator, an assistant, not a thinker. This wasn't just casual sexism, it was institutional erasure. For decades, scientific histories skipped over her completely. In fact, it wasn't until the 1970s that Ada's contributions were seriously reevaluated. And even then, it took the rise of feminist scholarship, computer historians, and a growing tech industry hungry for icons to fully resurrect her reputation. And once people did start paying attention, they were floored. Ada had seen it all coming. In her famous Note G, the one attached to her translation of Menabrea's article, she described how the analytical engine could manipulate not just numbers, but any symbolic content. She speculated that it could compose music of any degree of complexity or extent. This wasn't idle daydreaming. It was a description of programmable creativity. A century before the first digital synthesizer, the tech world was stunned. Women in computer science adopted Ada as a symbolic mother. In 1980, the U.S. Department of Defense even named a programming language after her, Ada. Elegant, powerful, designed for mission-critical systems like air traffic control and military defense. And suddenly, Ada was everywhere. Books, documentaries, posters in CS classrooms. It was a renaissance, but a belated one. As for Babbage, his revival came slower, but just as satisfying. The successful construction of his difference engine in 1991 and again in the early 2000s brought his designs to life for modern audiences. Seeing the machine work, with its gleaming brass, its satisfying clinks and clanks, proved that Babbage wasn't just a dreamer. He was a designer whose work transcended his century. More recently, both of their stories have inspired countless biographies, novels, plays, and even children's books. They are no longer side notes in history textbooks. They're front-page innovators. But it begs the question, why did it take so long? Part of the answer is timing. Babbage and Ada were victims of a world that simply wasn't ready. Their ideas were too abstract, too mechanical, too alien. Another part, the machinery of history tends to prioritize what works now, not what could have worked then. People like Babbage, who almost succeeded, are often overshadowed by those who finished the job. And of course, there's the uncomfortable truth. Historical memory is filtered through power. Ada's voice was easier to dismiss because she was a woman. Babbage was easier to ignore because he was cantankerous and broke. But the beautiful twist is that truth eventually clawed its way back. Their work was too good, too precise, too right to stay forgotten forever. Now, students learn about algorithmic thinking with Ada's name attached. Historians of technology begin their lectures with Babbage, not just Turing. Their legacy is secure, but it was a close call. In the next chapter, we'll go from past to future. Now that we have the machines, and understand their roots, the question becomes, what don't we understand yet? What will future generations look back on and say, how did they miss that? Because if Babbage taught us anything, it's that the future is easy to see once it's too late. Let's pause here and flip the lens. We've spent 10 chapters walking through the past, tracing the rise and long delay of an idea that changed the world. But now, it's time to ask the uncomfortable question, what are we missing today? Because if Babbage and Lovelace were ignored in their time, who's to say we're not doing the exact same thing right now? Somewhere out there, in a garage, a basement, a lab, maybe even a notebook no one's bothered to read, there could be another world-changing idea, one we'll laugh at, dismiss, or simply not notice until it's too late. History has a pattern. Visionaries rarely look like visionaries at the time. When Babbage showed off his difference engine prototype, most people saw clunky curiosity. When Ada predicted machine-generated music, her insights were brushed off as poetic nonsense. When Turing talked about thinking machines, he was viewed as eccentric, maybe even dangerous. And today, we still struggle to recognize the ideas that feel too advanced, too abstract, or too disruptive. Take quantum computing. Right now, it's like Babbage's analytical engine, hard to build, poorly understood by the public, and operating on a level of abstraction that even seasoned scientists admit feels weird. It's not fast, it's not user-friendly, but the potential is enormous. It could redefine encryption, optimization, simulation. It could, in short, break the way we currently think about computing. Sound familiar? Then there's A, not the friendly assistant kind, but the kind that learns, adapts, and makes decisions we don't fully understand. There are debates today that mirror the confusion of Babbage's time. Can machines really think? Can they create? Should we trust them? If Babbage was the father of mechanical computing and Ada the prophet of symbolic logic, then today's tech thinkers are grappling with the next frontier, cognition. And just like before, society is fumbling with the implications. We worship progress, but we're still bad at seeing its starting point. In every age, we tend to invest in what's already working instead of what could work. This is why Babbage's story matters more than just as a quirky historical anecdote. It's a mirror, a warning, a challenge. It reminds us to take seriously the weird ideas, to give space to the misunderstood minds, to fund the people who are too early, not just the ones who are already profitable. Imagine if Babbage had finished the analytical engine. Imagine if Ada had lived another 20 years to expand her work. What if programmable logic had become mainstream by 1850? Would we have reached the moon in 1920? Had the internet by 1900s? Smartphones in the 19Cs? History isn't just what happened. It's also what could have happened and didn't. The good news is we can learn. We can listen better. We can invest in the improbable, not just the practical. That's what progress really is. Not just building what's useful, but betting on what might become essential. So, as we stare into the future, with all its self-driving cars, robotic doctors, and eerily chatty algorithms, let's not forget the dusty, hand-drawn blueprints of a machine nobody believed in, because the next Babbage might already be here, And we owe it to them and to ourselves not to wait another 100 years to notice. In our final chapter, we'll return to the man himself, not as a legend or a prototype of a tech bro, but as a human being, stubborn, brilliant, often difficult, who dared to imagine something no one else could see. A man who dreamed in gears, and how, at last, the world started to dream with him. Picture Charles Babbage in his study, his desk overflowing with brass parts, pages of handwritten equations, half-finished schematics, and ink-stained notes that look more like the blueprint for a time machine than a calculator. He's pacing, muttering to himself, maybe even arguing with imaginary government officials. Again, he was brilliant, no question, but he was also exhausting. He pushed people away. He micromanaged. He changed designs mid-project, got distracted, and constantly demanded perfection. In short, he was human. And that's what we often forget when we turn people into icons. Babbage wasn't a flawless genius. He was obsessive, difficult, and occasionally kind of a jerk. But he also saw something no one else did. That's the deal with visionaries. They're not always easy to live with, but they change the world. He believed machines could do math better than humans, that a crank and a gear could outperform even the most diligent clerk. He didn't want to eliminate people. He wanted to eliminate error. He believed in precision, in logic, in order. And maybe that's why his ideas endured. Because even if the world couldn't build his machines, it couldn't ignore the clarity of his vision. In the years after his death in 1870, Babbage's name faded into obscurity. His machines were never completed. His ideas felt too wild, too complicated, too Victorian. But the strange thing about ideas, real ideas, is that they don't die. They wait. When the time came, and the right tools existed, Babbage's vision was plucked out of obscurity and rebuilt, gear by gear, thought by thought. Historians, engineers, and artists picked up where he left off, not to finish his machine necessarily, but to understand it, and by doing so, they understood us, because his machine wasn't just about math. It was about how we process the world, how we build knowledge, how we encode thoughts into logic and feed them into something that doesn't forget, doesn't blink, and never gets tired. And in the heart of that story, quietly, patiently, stood Ada Lovelace. Her belief that machines could create beauty, not just numbers, transform the cold logic of the analytical engine into something strangely poetic. Without her, Babbage might have been just another inventor with a cool but impractical gadget. Together, they were the alpha version of a modern computing. So what's the final takeaway? Maybe it's this. Genius doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up in a dusty workshop, covered in grease, muttering about logarithmic functions. And if we're not careful, we'll miss it. Charles Babbage never got to see a computer. He never typed on a keyboard, never Googled his name, never saw a glowing screen flicker to life. But his fingerprints are everywhere. They're in your smartphone, your laptop, your Jeeps, your video games, your taxes, unfortunately. Every time a machine runs an algorithm, processes a string of code, or executes a loop, it's whispering, very faintly, "This is for you, Charles." And Ada? Well, her ghost is in every creative algorithm, every generative AI, every attempt to teach a machine how to write, sing, or dream. She didn't just imagine a computer, she imagined a computer with a soul. Together, they dreamed up a future no one believed in, and proved that sometimes the most powerful ideas are the ones nobody understands. Yet,